The chilling intrigue surrounding what became known as the Blackthorn mystery has not yet faded from public curiosity. Whispers still drift through the streets, wild speculations refusing to die. At the urging of both my close associate, Inspector Graves, and the family involved, I have decided to chronicle the events as they truly unfolded, events that defied logic, tested my courage, and unraveled secrets long buried beneath the foundations of Blackthorn Manor. I found myself entangled in this affair quite by accident. After returning from an ill-fated expedition abroad, one that left me both physically and mentally scarred, I was granted an extended leave. With no immediate family to turn to, I was adrift, uncertain where to seek solace, until fate intervened. An unexpected encounter with an old acquaintance, Edward Ashford, set the wheels in motion. Edward had been a distant but familiar figure from my youth. Though nearly 15 years my senior, he had always exuded an air of effortless charm and quiet authority. His invitation to Blackthorn Manor, his family estate on the outskirts of Norfolk, seemed at the time a fortunate coincidence. "The old house has seen better days," Edward admitted with a wry smile. "But my mother would be thrilled to see you again." His mother, I recalled, had been a formidable woman, elegant, calculating, and fiercely protective of the Ashford legacy. To my astonishment, Edward revealed she had remarried, a woman of her stature, well into her 70s. Taking a new husband was scandalous enough, but it was the man she had chosen, a reclusive, enigmatic figure named Victor Blackwell, that sent shockwaves through my thoughts. A supposed distant relative, Blackwell had materialized from obscurity, within months ingratiated himself so deeply into the household that he now held sway over its affairs. "I take it you disapprove," I ventured, noting the sharp tension in Edward's jaw. "Disapprove," he scoffed. "Hastings, the man is a vulture, a shadow that crept in under the guise of companionship, and now lingers like a storm cloud over Blackthorn. My mother is blind to it, perhaps willfully so." A sinister chill settled over me as he spoke. I had no idea then just how dark the corridors of Blackthorn Manor had truly become, nor did I suspect that, within days of my arrival, a death would shatter the uneasy peace, and I would find myself standing amidst the wreckage of a crime that would shake the Ashford family to its core. Arrival at Blackthorn Manor. It must be a grim predicament for you all. Grim? It's a bloody nightmare. 3 days later, I found myself stepping off a rickety train at Blackthorn Hollow, a desolate station swallowed by encroaching ivy and silence. It stood alone in a vast stretch of moorland, as if forgotten by time. The air was thick with the scent of damper earth and something else, something faintly metallic. Edward Ashford, his face etched with fatigue, stood waiting for me, his fingers drumming anxiously against the door of a sleek but aging motor car, still managing to scrape by with fuel. "I see," I remarked, sliding into the passenger seat. He gave a humorless chuckle. "Perks of mother's connections." The journey from the station wound through twisted lanes and dense woodland, the towering oaks bending ominously overhead. The village of Blackthorn Hollow, if one could even call it that, was little more than a cluster of stone cottages, their windows dark and lifeless. A general air of unease clung to the place, though I couldn't yet place why. We passed through without a soul in sight. Beyond it, Blackthorn Manor loomed, a sprawling estate of grey stone and ivy-covered walls, its Gothic spires piercing the overcast sky. It was a place that had seen centuries of secrets, and I had no doubt it held more yet. "I should warn you, things are tense," Edward muttered, gripping the wheel a little too tightly. "I expected as much." "You don't understand," he said, voice low. "It's more than just the marriage. Victor Blackwell isn't merely unwelcome, he's feared. The servants whisper about him, the villagers cross the road when he walks by, and my mother," he hesitated, "she's different since the wedding. It's as if she's under some spell." A sharp gust of wind rattled the car as we pulled into the manor's grand driveway. The place exuded an unsettling stillness, as if the house itself was holding its breath. As we climbed out, the heavy front doors creaked open, revealing a tall woman in a dark hunting jacket. She had a severe face, sharp blue eyes, and a stance as rigid as a soldier's. "Welcome to Blackthorn," she said, offering a firm, bone-crushing handshake. "You'd best keep your wits about you." Charming introduction, I quipped. She didn't smile. Instead, she glanced toward the towering manor, then back at me. Just remember, she said flatly, no one really knows what goes on behind these walls. And with that, she turned and strode inside, leaving me standing there with a strange sensation creeping down my spine. I had arrived at Blackthorn Manor expecting unease, but now I was certain of it. Danger lurked within. You're far too skeptical, Eleanor. Edward chuckled, brushing the dirt from her gardening gloves. Where's tea today? Indoors or out? Out, of course. A day like this shouldn't be wasted inside, Eleanor replied briskly. Come along, you've been brooding long enough. Even you need a little respite, Edward. We followed her around the house to a grand sycamore tree, where an elegant tea service was arranged on a polished oak table. As we approached, a figure rose gracefully from a wicker chair, stepping forward with an effortless poise. My wife, Mr. Hastings, Edward introduced. I shall never forget my first glimpse of Lillian Ashford. She stood against the golden haze of the afternoon, her delicate frame wrapped in an aura of quiet intensity. Her eyes, green, almost feline, held a smoldering intelligence, as though she saw far more than she let on. There was something both arresting and elusive about her, a wild soul carefully concealed within a veneer of sophistication. I had met many women in my time, but none quite like her. Welcome to Blackthorn, Mr. Hastings, she said in a voice like velvet, her lips curving in a faint smile. As I settled into my chair, I felt for the first time in weeks, genuinely at ease. Lillian poured my tea with a graceful efficiency, her conversation light yet engaging. She listened intently, her responses measured but never dull. There was an unspoken understanding between us, that she observed more than she admitted, that there was far more to her than her poised demeanor suggested. Edward, for all his many virtues, was not a man of particularly dazzling wit, but Lillian, she was different. Her mere presence transformed the atmosphere, turning a simple tea gathering into something almost electric. The tranquility of the moment was shattered by the sound of a voice drifting through the open French doors, a rich honeyed tone, warm yet calculated. Then you'll see to the correspondence after tea, Victor. I'll handle the invitations for the Ashbury Gala myself. Or do you think we should wait to hear from the Duke? If he declines, Lady Harcourt could take the first evening, and perhaps Mrs. Montague the second. Then of course, there's the matter of the charity ball. A deep murmur of assent followed, and then the woman's voice, syrupy, adoring, resumed. Yes, that will do splendidly. You always think of everything, my dear Victor. Edward stiffened beside me, his grip tightening on the fragile porcelain cup in his hands. Across the table, Lillian remained perfectly composed, but I noticed the slightest flicker in her expression, a shadow of something unreadable, something sharp. And in that moment, I knew with certainty, beneath the polished surface of Blackthorn Manor, something dark simmered. The French window creaked open a little wider, and from its shadowed frame stepped a stately old woman, her silver hair catching the last glimmers of daylight. She carried herself with an air of effortless authority, the kind that needed no announcement. A moment later, a man emerged behind her, a figure at once subdued and oddly imposing, his movements marked by a quiet, almost studied grace. Ah, if it isn't the most wonderful surprise, the woman exclaimed, striding forward. Mr. Hastings, after all these years. She turned, her eyes softening. Victor, darling, this is Mr. Hastings, my husband. I turned my gaze to Victor, darling, studying him with immediate curiosity. He was an unusual figure, that much was certain. His presence was at odds with the grand English setting, his sleek, well-groomed beard, giving him the air of someone who belonged in a different world entirely. His pince-nez caught the light as he dipped his head slightly, offering me a hand that was firm, yet curiously lifeless. A pleasure, Mr. Hastings, he murmured, his voice low and deliberate. Then turning smoothly to his wife, he added, my dear Evelyn, I do believe this cushion is slightly damp. She beamed at him, utterly charmed, as he replaced it with another, his every motion laced with an exaggerated care. It was a peculiar display, overly attentive, oddly rehearsed. I found myself exchanging a glance with Miss Eleanor Howard, whose expression remained stony. She at least made no effort to disguise her contempt. The presence of Victor Castile seemed to cast a subtle but undeniable chill over the gathering. Conversations became clipped, movements more guarded. The genial air of the afternoon tea, which had felt so inviting moments before, now carried an undercurrent of tension. Evelyn, however, seemed entirely oblivious, launching into an animated discussion about an upcoming charity auction she was organizing. Occasionally she glanced at Victor for confirmation on dates or details, and he responded each time with the same unfaltering attentiveness. From the very first moment, I disliked him, and I trust my instincts. They rarely fail me. At some point, Evelyn turned to issue instructions to Eleanor, and Victor seized the opportunity to address me directly. His voice was carefully modulated, each word deliberate. "You are a soldier, Mr. Hastings, not by trade. Before the war, I worked at Lloyd's, and when the war is over, you will return to that life. Perhaps," I mused, "or perhaps something new entirely." Mary Castile, who had been listening quietly, leaned forward, her amber eyes catching mine. "If you could choose freely," she asked, "what would it be?" "That depends," I said with a smile. "No hidden passion," she pressed. "A secret ambition, perhaps. Everyone has one." "You'll laugh," I warned. "Try me." I hesitated for only a moment. "I've always had a secret longing to be a detective." A flicker of amusement touched her lips. "A Scotland Yard man, or more of a Sherlock Holmes?" "Oh, Holmes, undoubtedly," I admitted. "But in all seriousness, I do have an inclination for it. Once in Belgium, I had the privilege of meeting a most extraordinary detective, a man of remarkable intellect. He often said that true detective work was merely a matter of method. My approach is based on his, though naturally I've refined it further over the years. He was a peculiar little man, a bit of a dandy, but brilliant beyond measure. As I spoke, I felt an odd sensation, as if the very air around us had shifted. Across the table, Victor Castile watched me with the faintest trace of a smile. I could not tell whether it was one of amusement, or something else entirely. "I enjoy a good detective story myself," remarked Miss Eleanor Howard, her sharp eyes gleaming. "Though most of them are utter nonsense, always the big revelation at the end, everyone gasping. Real crime isn't like that. If you're close enough you just know." "There have been plenty of crimes that went undiscovered," I countered, stirring my tea. "Oh, I don't mean the police. I mean the ones who live in it. The family. You couldn't fool them. They'd sense it." Amused, I leaned back. "So if you found yourself in the midst of a murder, you believe you'd recognize the killer at once?" "Without a doubt," she declared. "Might not have the evidence to wave around in court, but I'd feel it, right in my bones. If he or she stood near me, I'd know." "It might be a woman," I pointed out. "Perhaps, but murder is a violent act. I associate it more with a man. Not in the case of poisoning." The quiet voice belonged to Mary Castile. She spoke so suddenly that even I started. "Dr. Ashworth was saying just yesterday that there are probably countless poisonings that never get detected. So many poisons are uncommon, overlooked. The medical profession rarely questions them." "Mary," Evelyn Castile laughed uneasily. "What a gruesome thing to say. You're giving me chills." She shivered theatrically, then brightened. "Oh look, there's Lillian." A young woman in a crisp white VD uniform came striding across the lawn, all energy and life. "Lillian, dear, you're terribly late," Evelyn scolded affectionately. "This is Mr. Hastings, Lillian Moray." Lillian Murdoch was a striking young woman, her auburn hair glowing in the afternoon sun. She pulled off her cap with a careless motion, shaking out thick waves of hair. Her features were lively, and her deep brown eyes held a mischief that was instantly engaging. She threw herself onto the grass beside John, flashing me a playful smile as she accepted a plate of sandwiches. "Much nicer down here," she said. "Come sit." Obligingly, I lowered myself onto the lawn. "You work at Ravenshire Hospital, don't you, Miss Moray?" She nodded. "For my sins. Are they cruel to you?" I asked teasingly. "I'd like to see them try," Lillian declared with mock indignation. "I have a cousin who's a nurse," I said. "She's terrified of the senior sisters, and quite rightly so," she agreed dramatically. "Sisters are terrifying, Mr. Hastings. They simply are. You've no idea, but luckily I don't work in the wards. I'm in the dispensary." I raised an eyebrow. "How many people have you poisoned so far?" Lillian grinned. "Oh, hundreds." At that moment, Evelyn called, "Lillian dear, Could you write a few letters for me? Of course, Aunt Evelyn. She leapt to her feet, and for the first time I caught a glimpse of something different in her, a quiet understanding that no matter how much affection Evelyn showed, Lillian's place in this house was not entirely her own. Evelyn turned to me with her usual warmth. John will show you to your room. Supper is at 7:30. We abandoned late dinners ages ago. Lady Ravenshaw agrees with me. Extravagance is out of place in times like these. We run a war-conscious household, Mr. Hastings. Nothing goes to waste. I murmured my approval, and John led me into the grand old house, up a wide staircase that split in two leading to opposite wings. My room was in the left wing, overlooking the vast sprawling parklands. As I set my case down, a faint creak echoed in the corridor outside. The house was old. Houses like these had memories and secrets. I had the oddest feeling I was about to uncover one. John left me to my own thoughts, and as I glanced out of my window, I saw him strolling across the lawn, his arm linked with Cynthia Moret's. They moved leisurely, their conversation hushed in the golden evening light. But then, from the house, Evelyn's sharp voice rang out. "Cynthia." The girl, startled, hesitated for a fraction of a second, then turned and ran back inside. I watched as, from beneath the shadow of a gnarled oak, a man stepped forward, emerging into the dimming light. He moved slowly, deliberately, his dark eyes fixed ahead with an intensity that unsettled me. His face was pale, his features finely drawn, and though years had passed since we last met, I recognized him at once. Lawrence Castile, John's younger brother. He looked up towards my window as he passed beneath it, and for the briefest moment, our eyes met. There was something in his expression, something raw, something barely contained, a storm beneath the surface. What had put that look there? What had unsettled him so profoundly? Then just as quickly, he was gone, swallowed by the lengthening shadows of the garden. I turned away, shaking off the unease that had settled over me, and let my thoughts drift to my own affairs. The evening passed pleasantly enough, filled with soft laughter and the clinking of glasses. That night, I dreamt of Mary Castile, the enigmatic woman, whose presence in the house felt like a whisper of something I couldn't quite name. The morning dawned bright and sharp, the air crisp with the last traces of night's cool embrace. I did not see Mary until lunch, when she proposed a walk. We spent the afternoon wandering beneath the autumn-streaked canopy of Blackwood's ancient trees, her voice lilting as she spoke of books, of music, of the strange and shifting nature of fate. We returned to the house as the sky deepened to amber. As we stepped into the great hall, John appeared, his expression tense. "Come with me," he said. Mary and I exchanged a glance before following him into the smoking room. He closed the door behind us with a finality that set my nerves on edge. "There's been trouble," he said grimly. "Eleanor's had a fight with Alfred Castile. She's leaving." "Leaving?" Mary's voice was sharp with disbelief. John nodded, his mouth a thin, dissatisfied line. "Yes, she went to Mother," and door swung open. Eleanor Howard stood there, a small suitcase in one hand, her posture rigid with defiance. But beneath the steely resolve, I saw something else. A fire, a barely contained fury. "At least I spoke my mind," she declared. "My dear Eleanor," Mary said, stepping forward, "this can't be serious." "Oh, it's serious," Eleanor said, her lips curling into something between a smile. "I told Emily exactly what I thought of her darling husband, and she didn't like it one bit. I said, 'You're a fool, Emily, a blind, ridiculous fool. He's 20 years younger than you. What do you think he married you for? Love?' She laughed coldly. 'Money, power, and if you think he won't take everything you have and leave you with nothing, you're even more naive than I thought.'" There was a heavy silence. John exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "Eleanor, I'm not done." Eleanor's voice was dangerously low now. "I warned her," I said. "You think you know that man. You don't. He'd as soon put a knife in your back as look at you. And if you don't believe me, just ask him where he's been sneaking off to at night. Ask him why he spends so much time at the inn. Ask him who he's meeting there." Mary gasped. I felt a cold weight settle in my stomach. "And what did she say to that?" I asked. Eleanor's eyes "Oh, you can imagine. My darling Alfred," she mocked. "My devoted husband. How dare you spread such wicked lies, Eleanor? You're just a jealous, hateful woman." Her fingers tightened around the handle of her suitcase, so I told her she'd regret it. And now I'm leaving. But not now, Mary protested. This minute, Eleanor said firmly. We all stared at her. John made one last attempt to reason with her, but her decision was final. With a muttered curse, he stalked off to check the train schedule, and Mary hesitated before following, murmuring something about speaking to Emily again. The moment the door closed behind them, Eleanor turned to me, her fierce expression shifting into something else entirely, something urgent. And then, in a voice just above a whisper, she said, "Listen to me, Hastings. You need to keep your eyes open in this house, because something is very, very wrong. Mr. Graves, you're honest. I can trust you." I was caught off guard by the urgency in Eleanor's voice. She placed a firm hand on my arm, and leaned in, her breath barely a whisper. "Watch over her, Mr. Graves. My poor sister. She's surrounded by vultures, all of them circling, waiting. Oh, I know their type too well. Not one of them isn't desperate, clawing for a piece of her wealth. I've kept them at bay for as long as I could, but now that I'm leaving, they'll close in." "Of course, Miss Howard," I assured her, though her intensity unsettled me. "I'll keep an eye on things, but surely you're just overwrought." She silenced me with a slow, deliberate shake of her head. "You're young, Graves. You don't know the world like I do. Just watch. Keep your eyes open. You'll see soon enough." From the open window came the distant rumble of the waiting automobile. Eleanor straightened, casting one last glance over her shoulder as she reached for the door handle. Her gaze darkened, and she motioned me closer. "Most of all," she said, her voice like steel wrapped in velvet, "watch that devil, her husband." And then she was gone, stepping out into the corridor where the others awaited her departure. A chorus of protests rose, pleas for her to reconsider, but the Inglethorpes, they did not appear. As the car pulled away, Mary Castile suddenly detached herself from the small gathering, and strode across the gravel path towards a tall bearded man approaching from the garden. The color rose in her cheeks as she extended a hand to him, and I felt a strange unease stir within me. "Who is that?" I asked John sharply, a gut instinct whispering its distrust. "That's Dr. Alistair Renaud," John replied tersely. "And who is Dr. Renaud?" "A specialist from London. He came here for a rest cure after a breakdown. Brilliant man, they say, one of the foremost experts on toxins and rare poisons, and he's a great friend of Mary's," Cynthia added with her usual irreverence. John's expression darkened, and without another word, he turned away. "Let's take a walk, Graves. This whole business has been a damn mess." Eleanor always had a sharp tongue, but you'd be hard-pressed to find a more loyal friend. We took the winding path through the estate's dense woodland, the golden light filtering through the trees casting long shifting shadows. By the time we reached the village, a stillness had settled over the air, thick with an unspoken tension. As we passed a rusted iron gate on our way back, a striking young woman with dark, piercing eyes approached from the opposite direction. She smiled, just slightly, as she inclined her head in greeting. "She's beautiful," I remarked, unable to ignore the way her presence seemed to linger even after she had passed. John's face hardened. "That's Vivienne Reichs, the same woman Eleanor warned." "Yes," he said abruptly, cutting me off. I thought then of the grand house looming at the edge of the estate, of the frail but formidable woman who ruled it, and of the sharp-eyed beauty who had just crossed our path. A vague sense of dread crept into my thoughts, like a whisper in the dark. I pushed it aside. "Blackwood Hall is magnificent," I said, hoping to shake the unease. John let out a dry chuckle, though there was no mirth in it. "It should have been mine. By all rights it would have been mine if my father had made a fair will. Instead I'm left scraping by, while..." He stopped himself abruptly, his expression clouding over. "You're in financial trouble?" I asked carefully. John let out a sigh, running a hand through his hair. "I don't mind telling you, Graves. I'm in deeper than I care to admit. Couldn't your brother help, Lawrence?" John scoffed. "He squandered everything he had printing ridiculous poetry books no one reads. No, we're a family drowning in debt, except for my stepmother, who up until her marriage was generous. But now," he exhaled sharply. "Well, since he came into the picture." He fell silent, but I didn't need him to finish the thought. The shadows of Blackwood Hall stretched long in the evening light, and something told me, whatever had begun in that house was far from over. For the first time I felt an unsettling void settle over Blackwood Hall. With Eleanor Howard gone, A strange and disquieting absence took its place, one that whispered of uncertainty and unseen dangers. Her presence had been an anchor, an unspoken assurance against the undercurrents of deceit that now seemed to swirl unchecked. Without her, the air felt different, thick with something unspoken. A strange tension crackled through the house, an invisible thread of unease stretching between those who remained. Faces I had once regarded with neutrality now seemed tinged with something darker. Was that calculation in their glances, or merely the ghosts of my own growing paranoia? The enigmatic Dr. Renaud came to mind, his piercing gaze lingering in my thoughts like an unanswered question. Something about him unsettled me, though I could not yet name why. A creeping sensation crawled down my spine as I stood there staring at the grand silent corridors of the house. For just a fleeting second, a shadow of foreboding passed over me, an unshakable feeling that something was coming, something inevitable, and whatever it was, I doubted any of us would escape untouched. Chapter the 2nd, the 16th and 17th of July. I had arrived at Styles on the 5th of July. I come now to the events of the 16th and 17th of that month. For the convenience of the reader, I will recapitulate the incidents of those days in as exact a manner as possible. They were elicited subsequently at the trial by a process of long and tedious cross-examinations. I received a letter from Evelyn Howard a couple of days after her departure, telling me she was working as a nurse at the big hospital in Midlingham, a manufacturing town some 15 miles away, and begging me to let her know if Mrs. Inglethorpe should show any wish to be reconciled. The only fly in the ointment of my peaceful days was Mrs. Cavendish's extraordinary, and for my part, unaccountable preference for the society of Dr. Bowerstein. What she saw in the man I cannot imagine, but she was always asking him up to the house, and often went off for long expeditions with him. I must confess that I was quite unable to see his attraction. The 16th of July fell on a Monday. It was a day of turmoil. The famous bazaar had taken place on Saturday, and an entertainment, in connection with the same charity, at which Mrs. Inglethorpe was to recite a war poem, was to be held that night. We were all busy during the morning, arranging and decorating the hall in the village where it was to take place. We had a late luncheon, and spent the afternoon resting in the garden. I noticed that John's manner was somewhat unusual. He seemed very excited and restless. After tea, Mrs. Inglethorpe went to lie down to rest before her efforts in the evening, and I challenged Mary Cavendish to a single at tennis. About 6:45, Mrs. Inglethorpe called us that we should be late as supper was early that night. We had rather a scramble to get ready in time, and before the meal was over the motor was waiting at the door. The entertainment was a great success, Mrs. Inglethorpe's recitation receiving tremendous applause. There were also some tableaux in which Cynthia took part. She did not return with us, having been asked to a supper party, and to remain the night with some friends who had been acting with her in the tableau. The following morning, Mrs. Inglethorpe stayed in bed to breakfast, as she was rather overtired, but she appeared in her briskest mood about 12:30, and swept Lawrence and myself off to a luncheon party. Such a charming invitation from Mrs. Rolleston, Lady Tadminster's sister, you know. The Rollestons came over with the Conqueror, one of our oldest families. Mary had excused herself on the plea of an engagement with Dr. Bowerstein. We had a pleasant luncheon, and as we drove away Lawrence suggested that we should return by Tadminster, which was barely a mile out of our way, and pay a visit to Cynthia in her dispensary. Mrs. Inglethorpe replied that this was an excellent idea, but as she had several letters to write, she would drop us there, and we could come back with Cynthia in the pony trap. We were detained under suspicion by the hospital porter, until Cynthia appeared to vouch for us, looking very cool and sweet in her long white overall. She took us up to her sanctum, and introduced us to her fellow dispenser, a rather awe-inspiring individual, whom Cynthia cheerily addressed as Nibs. "What a lot of bottles," I exclaimed, as my eye travelled round the small room. "Do you really know what's in them all?" "Say something original," groaned Cynthia. "Every single person who comes up here says that. We are really thinking of bestowing a prize on the first individual who does not say what a lot of bottles. And I know the next thing you're going to say is how many people have you poisoned." I pleaded guilty with a laugh. If you people only knew how fatally easy it is to poison someone by mistake, you wouldn't joke about it. Come on, let's have tea. We've got all sorts of secret stores in that cupboard. No, Lawrence, that's the poison cupboard. The big cupboard, that's right. We had a very cheery tea, and assisted Cynthia to wash up afterwards. We had just put away the last teaspoon, when a knock came at the door. The countenances of Cynthia and Nibs were suddenly petrified into a stern and forbidding expression. "Come in," said Cynthia, in a sharp professional tone. A young and rather scared-looking nurse appeared with a bottle which she proffered to Nibs, who waved her towards Cynthia with the somewhat enigmatical remark, "I'm not really here today." Cynthia took the bottle and examined it with the severity of a judge. "This should have been sent up this morning. Sister is very sorry, she forgot. Sister should read the rules outside the door." I gathered from the little nurse's expression that there was not the least likelihood of her having the hardihood to retail this message to the dreaded sister. "So now it can't be done until tomorrow," finished Cynthia. "Don't you think you could possibly let us have it tonight?" "Well," said Cynthia graciously, "we are very busy, but if we have time it shall be done." The little nurse withdrew, and Cynthia promptly took a jar from the shelf, refilled the bottle, and placed it on the table outside the door. I laughed. "Discipline must be maintained." "Exactly. Come out on our little balcony, you can see all the outside wards there." I followed Cynthia and her friend, and they pointed out the different wards to me. Lawrence remained behind, but after a few moments, Cynthia called to him over her shoulder to come and join us. Then she looked at her watch. "Nothing more to do, Nibs?" "No." "All right, then we can lock up and go." I had seen Lawrence in quite a different light that afternoon. Compared to John, he was an astoundingly difficult person to get to know. He was the opposite of his brother in almost every respect, being unusually shy and reserved, yet he had a certain charm of manner, and I fancied that, if one really knew him well, one could have a deep affection for him. I had always fancied that his manner to Cynthia was rather constrained, and that she on her side was inclined to be shy of him, but they were both gay enough this afternoon, and chatted together like a couple of children. As we drove through the village, I remembered that I wanted some stamps, so accordingly we pulled up at the post office. As I came out again, I cannoned into a little man who was just entering. I drew aside and apologized, when suddenly, with a loud exclamation, he clasped me in his arms, and kissed me warmly. "Mon ami Hastings," he cried. "It is indeed mon ami Hastings." "Poirot," I exclaimed. I turned to the pony trap. "This is a very pleasant meeting for me, Miss Cynthia. This is my old friend, Monsieur Poirot, whom I have not seen for years." "Oh, we know Monsieur Poirot," said Cynthia gaily, "but I had no idea he was a friend of yours." "Yes, indeed," said Poirot seriously. "I know Mademoiselle Cynthia. It is by the charity of that good Mrs. Inglethorpe that I am here." Then as I looked at him inquiringly, "Yes, my friend. She had kindly extended hospitality to 7 of my country people, who alas are refugees from their native land. We Belgians will always remember her with gratitude." Poirot was an extraordinary-looking little man. He was hardly more than 5 feet, 4 inches, but carried himself with great dignity. His head was exactly the shape of an egg, and he always perched it a little on one side. His moustache was very stiff and military. The neatness of his attire was almost incredible. I believe a speck of dust would have caused him more pain than a bullet wound. Yet this quaint dandified little man, who I was sorry to see, now limped badly, had been in his time one of the most celebrated members of the Belgian police. As a detective, his flair had been extraordinary, and he had achieved triumphs by unraveling some of the most baffling cases of the day. He pointed out to me the little house inhabited by him and his fellow Belgians, and I promised to go and see him at an early date. Then he raised his hat with a flourish to Cynthia, and we drove away. "He's a dear little man," said Cynthia. "I'd no idea you knew him." "You've been entertaining a celebrity unawares," I replied, and for the rest of the way home, I recited to them the various exploits and triumphs of Hercule Poirot. We arrived back in a very cheerful mood. As we entered the hall, Mrs. Inglethorpe came out of her boudoir. She looked flushed and upset. "Oh, it's you," she said. "Is there anything the matter, Aunt Emily?" asked Cynthia. "Certainly not," said Mrs. Inglethorpe sharply. "What should there be?" Then catching sight of Dorcas, the parlour maid, going into the dining room, She called to her to bring some stamps into the boudoir. Yes, Mon. The old servant hesitated, then added diffidently, don't you think, Mon, you'd better get to bed? You're looking very tired. Perhaps you're right, Dorcas.
No, not now.
I've some letters I must finish by post time. Have you lighted the fire in my room as I told you? Yes, Mon. Then I'll go to bed directly after supper. She went into the boudoir again, and Cynthia stared after her. Goodness gracious, I wonder what's up, she said to Lawrence. He did not seem to have heard her, for without a word, he turned on his heel and went out of the house. I suggested a quick game of tennis before supper, and Cynthia agreeing, I ran upstairs to fetch my racket. Mrs. Cavendish was coming down the stairs. It may have been my fancy, but she too was looking odd and disturbed. Had a good walk with Dr. Bauerstein? I asked, trying to appear as indifferent as I could. I didn't go, she replied abruptly. Where is Mrs. Inglethorpe? In the boudoir. Her hand clenched itself on the banisters, then she seemed to nerve herself for some encounter, and went rapidly past me down the stairs across the hall to the boudoir, the door of which she shut behind her. As I ran out to the tennis court a few moments later, I had to pass the open boudoir window, and was unable to help overhearing the following scrap of dialogue. Mary Cavendish was saying in the voice of a woman desperately controlling herself, "Then you won't show it to me," to which Mrs. Inglethorpe replied, "My dear Mary, it has nothing to do with that matter." "Then show it to me. I tell you it is not what you imagine. It does not concern you in the least." To which Mary Cavendish replied, with a rising bitterness, "Of course I might have known you would shield him." Cynthia was waiting for me, and greeted me eagerly with, "I say, there's been the most awful row. I've got it all out of Dorcas." "What kind of a row?" "Between Aunt Emily and him. I do hope she's found him out at last." "Was Dorcas there then?" "Of course not. She happened to be near the door. It was a real old bust-up. I do wish I knew what it was all about." I thought of Mrs. Rakes's gypsy face, and Evelyn Howard's warnings, but wisely decided to hold my peace, whilst Cynthia exhausted every possible hypothesis, and cheerfully hoped, "Aunt Emily will send him away, and will never speak to him again." I was anxious to get hold of John, but he was nowhere to be seen. Evidently, something very momentous had occurred that afternoon. I tried to forget the few words I had overheard, but do what I would, I could not dismiss them altogether from my mind. What was Mary Cavendish's concern in the matter? Mr. Inglethorpe was in the drawing-room when I came down to supper. His face was impassive as ever, and the strange unreality of the man struck me afresh. Mrs. Inglethorpe came down last. She still looked agitated, and during the meal, there was a somewhat constrained silence. Inglethorpe was unusually quiet. As a rule, he surrounded his wife with little attentions, placing a cushion at her back, and altogether playing the part of the devoted husband. Immediately after supper, Mrs. Inglethorpe retired to her boudoir again. "Send my coffee in here, Mary," she called. "I've just 5 minutes to catch the post." Cynthia and I went and sat by the open window in the drawing-room. Mary Cavendish brought our coffee to us. She seemed excited. "Do you young people want lights, or do you enjoy the twilight?" she asked. "Will you take Mrs. Inglethorpe her coffee, Cynthia? I will pour it out." "Do not trouble, Mary," said Inglethorpe. "I will take it to Emily." He poured it out, and went out of the room, carrying it carefully. Lawrence followed him, and Mrs. Cavendish sat down by us. We three sat for some time in silence. It was a glorious night, hot and still. Mrs. Cavendish fanned herself gently with a palm leaf. "It's almost too hot," she murmured. "We shall have a thunderstorm." Alas, that these harmonious moments can never endure. My paradise was rudely shattered by the sound of a well-known, and heartily disliked, voice in "Dr. Bauerstein!" exclaimed Cynthia. "What a funny time to come." I glanced jealously at Mary Cavendish, but she seemed quite undisturbed. The delicate pallor of her cheeks did not vary. In a few moments, Alfred Inglethorpe had ushered the doctor in, the latter laughing, and protesting that he was in no fit state for a drawing-room. In truth, he presented a sorry spectacle, being literally plastered with mud. "What have you been doing, doctor?" cried Mrs. Cavendish. "I must make my apologies," said the doctor. "I did not really mean to come in, but Mr. Inglethorpe insisted." "Well, Bowerstein, you are in a plight," said John, strolling in from the hall. "Have some coffee and tell us what you have been up to." "Thank you, I will." He laughed rather ruefully as he described how he had discovered a very rare species of fern in an inaccessible place, and in his efforts to obtain it had lost his footing and slipped ignominiously into a neighboring pond. "The sun soon dried me off," he added, "but I'm afraid my appearance is very disreputable." At this juncture, Mrs. Inglethorpe called to Cynthia from the hall, and the girl ran out. "Just carry up my dispatch case, will you, dear? I'm going to bed." The door into the hall was a wide one. I had risen when Cynthia did. John was close by me. There were therefore 3 witnesses who could swear that Mrs. Inglethorpe was carrying her coffee, as yet untasted, in her hand. My evening was utterly and entirely spoilt by the presence of Dr. Bowerstein. It seemed to me the man would never go. He rose at last, however, and I breathed a sigh of relief. "I'll walk down to the village with you," said Mr. Inglethorpe. "I must see our agent over those estate accounts." He turned to John. "No one need sit up. I will take the latchkey." A deep, unnatural silence had settled over Ravenwood Manor when I was startled, awake by a sharp knock at my door. As I sat up, still disoriented, the door creaked open, revealing Victor Henshaw, his face pale and eyes wide with alarm. He held a flickering candle in one trembling hand, its unsteady glow casting ghostly shadows across his features. "It's Lady Blackwood," he said hoarsely, barely above a whisper. "Something's terribly wrong. She won't respond, and the door is locked from inside." At once the fog of sleep left me. I threw on a robe and followed him down the dimly lit corridor. The vast house, so grand by day, seemed to press in around us in the darkness, its silence thick with an unspoken dread. As we reached the east wing, we found the others already gathered. Jonathan Blackwood, his expression grim and resolute, the housekeeper Mrs. Greaves wringing her hands, and 2 wide-eyed maids, whispering in hushed, fearful tones. But it was the absence that struck me most. Arthur Blackwood, Lady Blackwood's husband, was nowhere to be seen. Jonathan stepped forward, grasping the handle of her bedroom door, and rattling it violently. "Mother, can you hear me?" His voice was urgent, but no reply came from within, only a faint gurgling moan that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. "She's in distress," gasped Mrs. Greaves. "We must get to her." The adjoining room, Victor Arthur's chamber, connects to hers. A chill ran through me. Had he not been sleeping beside her? Where was he now? Without another word, we rushed to his room. The door swung open easily, revealing an undisturbed bed, the sheets smooth, untouched. The room was empty, and the door to Lady Blackwood's chamber, locked. From the inside, a sharp knock at the door shattered the eerie silence of the house, but this knock was not from any of us. It came from within her room. A single deliberate tap, and then another. Something or someone was waiting. A deep, guttural moan echoed through the silent corridors of Ravenwood Manor, sending a shiver down my spine. The house, which had once seemed merely grand, now loomed like a monstrous shadow, its very walls pulsing with unseen tension. Then came the pounding at my door. I sat up abruptly, my heart thudding. Victor Henshaw stood in the doorway, his face pale as the flickering candle he gripped in his trembling hand. His voice, when he spoke, was little more than a rasp. "It's Lady Blackwood," he said hoarsely. "Something's terribly wrong. She won't respond, and the door is locked from inside." Adrenaline surged through me as I flung off the covers and pulled on my robe. The moment I stepped into the corridor, I sensed it, something oppressive, something heavy in the very air. At the far end of the hallway, a group had gathered. Jonathan Blackwood stood in the center, his jaw tight with tension, fists clenched at his sides. The housekeeper, Mrs. Greaves, wrung her hands, while 2 wide-eyed maids huddled near the wall, whispering in fearful tones. But what sent a chill through me was the empty space beside them. Arthur Blackwood, Lady Blackwood's husband, was nowhere to be seen. Jonathan grabbed the handle of her bedroom door and twisted it violently. "Mother, can you hear me?" His voice was edged with panic. No response came from within, only a low gurgling moan that made my skin prickle. "She's in distress," gasped Mrs. Greaves. "We must get to her." Victor turned to Jonathan. "The adjoining room, Arthur's chamber, it connects to hers." Jonathan's expression darkened. "Where the hell is he?" Without another word, we rushed to Arthur's room. The door swung open easily, revealing an undisturbed bed, the sheets smooth, untouched. The wardrobe stood slightly ajar, the inside cloaked in darkness. The room was empty. A cold unease gripped me as we turned to the connecting door, leading to Lady Blackwood's chamber. Jonathan tried the handle, locked. From the inside, for a moment silence, then a whisper of movement, a single deliberate knock, then another, from within. Jonathan took a step back, his breathing ragged. "We have to break it down." Victor hesitated. "There's another way. Cynthia's room. It shares a door with hers. Is it unlocked?" "It's always bolted." Jonathan ran to check anyway. He found Cynthia still asleep, Mary Blackwood shaking her, struggling to wake her. "No use," he muttered as he returned. "We have no choice." Together we braced against the locked door. The frame groaned under our weight. The first shove did nothing, the second barely budged it, but on the third wood splintered, and with a deafening crash, the door gave way. We stumbled inside. The air was thick with a strange, acrid scent. Lady Blackwood lay sprawled on the massive canopy bed, her body convulsing in violent spasms. Her mouth was open in a silent scream, hands clawing at the air. Beside her, the bedside table lay overturned, a shattered glass glistening in the dim candlelight. "Brandy!" Jonathan barked at one of the maids, who ran downstairs without hesitation. He strode to the gas lamp and lit it, bathing the room in a dim, sickly glow. I rushed to unbolt the main door, allowing the others to enter. I turned back, only to see Victor, frozen, his candle trembling in his hand. His face had gone deathly pale. His eyes, wide with an emotion I couldn't place, were locked onto the far wall. He stared, unblinking, unbreathing, like a man who had glimpsed something not meant for human eyes. Instinctively I followed his gaze. The wall was bare, nothing, but Victor saw something, something that turned his blood to ice. The dying embers in the hearth cast faint shadows across the room, their glow barely reaching the edges of the ornate mantelpiece. The delicate porcelain figurines stood in their usual rigid formation, unmoved by the chaos unfolding around them. But there was something in the air, something unseen yet suffocating, a presence that gripped the room with an icy hand. Lady Blackwood, once poised and commanding, now lay frail upon the bed, her breath shallow, her voice trembling as she forced out her words. "Better now, so sudden, foolish of me, to lock myself in." Her lips quivered between each gasp, her body shuddering as though fighting an invisible force. At the door, Mary Blackwood had appeared, her slender frame silhouetted against the dim light filtering through the hallway. One arm was wrapped protectively around Cynthia, who seemed barely able to stand. The girl's usually bright, inquisitive eyes were dull, her face flushed, her movements sluggish as she yawned repeatedly. "Poor Cynthia is quite shaken," Mary murmured, her voice unusually steady. She was dressed in her simple white morning gown, a realization that sent a jolt through me. "Morning?" I turned sharply towards the window. The heavy curtains had begun to betray the arrival of dawn, a faint sliver of light creeping into the room. My gaze flicked to the clock on the mantelpiece. Just before 5, a sharp, inhuman cry shattered the stillness. Lady Blackwood's body jerked violently, her fingers clawing at the sheets, as a fresh wave of convulsions seized her. The sight was grotesque, unnatural. Her back arched off the mattress, in a way no human form should, her muscles locked, her face contorted in agony. A flurry of movement erupted, as Mary and Jonathan tried to steady her, but their efforts were futile. A silver tray clattered to the ground, sending a crystal glass rolling under the bed. The acrid scent of spilled brandy filled the air. Another convulsion, more violent than the last. I had seen seizures before, but nothing like this. Lady Blackwood's body seemed caught in an invisible grip, held in an eerie, tortuous arch, resting only on the back of her skull and her heels. The horror of it was paralyzing. Then the door burst open. "Doctor." Everett stepped inside, his usually composed face momentarily frozen in shock. The sight before him was grotesque, almost unreal. He recovered quickly, striding forward with authority. Lady Blackwood gasped, her eyes rolling wildly before locking onto the doctor. "Arthur, Arthur." The words came out as a rasp, strangled, as though dragged from the depths of her very being. Then, with a final tremor, her body collapsed back onto the bed, utterly still. Dr. Everett sprang into action, his hands working methodically, attempting to revive her. The room fell into stunned silence, save for the rhythmic movement of his arms, as he pressed against her chest. The only sound was the faint, ragged breathing of those watching. Then he stopped. A deep, solemn breath escaped him, as he stepped back, shaking his head. A rustling at the doorway drew our attention. Dr. Wilkins, the Blackwoods' long-time physician, waddled in, his round face flushed from exertion. He carried with him an air of forced composure, though I noticed his hands trembled as he adjusted his spectacles. Dear me, terribly unfortunate," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. He clucked his tongue as he approached the bed. "The poor lady worked far too hard, against my advice. I always warned her." "Take it easy," I said. "Take it easy." But no, always too much on her plate. The body can only bear so much. Nature rebels, yes, nature rebels. His voice droned on, yet Dr. Everett remained silent, watching him with an expression I could not quite place. Then, in a voice quiet but firm, he spoke. "The convulsions were of an unusual violence, Dr. Wilkins, quite unlike anything I have ever seen. You did not witness them, but they were unmistakably tetanic in nature." A heavy silence followed. The weight of his words hung in the air. For the first time that night, I felt it, an undeniable truth. This was no ordinary death. "Ah," Dr. Wilkins said sagely, though his tone carried more self-importance than insight. Dr. Everett, however, barely acknowledged him. His sharp eyes flicked toward Jonathan. "I need to speak with Dr. Wilkins in private," he said, his voice carefully measured. "You don't object, do you?" Jonathan, though visibly exhausted, straightened slightly. "Of course not." With that, the rest of us were ushered into the hallway. Behind us I heard the faint, decisive click of the key turning in the lock. The room, the crime scene, was now sealed. We descended the grand staircase slowly, the weight of the night's horrors pressing down upon us. My mind raced, piecing together fragments of the strange puzzle unfolding before me. The tension in the house was thick, almost tangible. No one spoke. Then, out of the silence, I felt a light touch on my arm. Mary Blackwood. Her face was pale, her normally composed features drawn with anxiety. "What is it?" she whispered urgently. Why did Dr. Everett seem so unusual? I hesitated, glancing around to ensure no one else was within earshot. Lawrence and Jonathan were a few steps ahead, lost in their own thoughts. Lowering my voice, I leaned toward her. "Do you know what I suspect?" She swallowed, her lips parting slightly. "What?" I hesitated, for the briefest moment before saying it. "I believe she was poisoned." Mary sucked in a sharp breath, her fingers tightening on my sleeve. For an instant she stood frozen, her eyes wide, pupils blown with shock. Then, without warning, she gasped, a strangled, desperate sound. "No, no." Her voice rose raw with horror. "Not that, not that." Before I could react, she turned and fled up the stairs, her white gown billowing behind her like a spectre. Alarmed, I followed, my heart pounding. Was she going to faint? Was she in danger? I found her at the top of the landing, gripping the banister for support, her face ashen. "Mary," she waved me off, her breath coming in rapid, shallow gulps. "No, leave me." Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it was firm. "I need a moment, just a moment alone. Please." I hesitated. Every instinct told me to stay, to press further, but something in her expression warned me otherwise. So reluctantly, I turned away and descended the stairs. In the dining room, Jonathan and Lawrence sat in heavy silence. The weight of the night had drained the energy from them. I finally spoke the question that had been gnawing at all of us. "Where is Alfred Blackwood?" Jonathan's expression darkened. He shook his head. "He's not in the house." For a moment the room was deathly still. Our eyes met. Alfred's absence was more than strange, it was damning. And then I remembered Lady Blackwood's dying words, her eyes wide with terror, fixed on some unseen spectre, as she choked out that one name, Arthur. Arthur. Was it a plea, a warning, or an accusation? My skin prickled. What more could she have told us, if she had only had more time? The heavy sound of footsteps on the stairs broke the silence. The doctors had finished their examination. Dr. Wilkins entered first, puffed up with importance, though he attempted to maintain a facade of solemn dignity. His eyes glimmered with a barely concealed sense of self-importance. Behind him Dr. Everett followed, his expression unreadable. He was watching Dr. Wilkins intently, as though studying him rather than the situation at hand. Dr. Wilkins cleared his throat and addressed Jonathan. "Mr. Blackwood," he began, "I require your consent for a post-mortem examination." Jonathan's jaw tensed, his hands clenching into fists at his sides, his face twisted for the briefest moment, a flicker of pain, of reluctance. "Is that necessary?" he asked, his voice heavy. Dr. Everett, standing slightly apart, spoke for the first time since entering the room. His words were soft, but there was no mistaking the gravity in them. "It is more than necessary," he said. "It is vital." A chill ran through me. Lady Blackwood's death was no mere tragedy. It was something far darker, something deliberate. "Absolutely," said Dr. Everett, his voice calm but firm. Jonathan's gaze sharpened. "And by that you mean that neither Dr. Wilkins nor I can, under these circumstances, issue a death certificate?" For a long moment Jonathan remained silent, his head bowed slightly, as though the weight of the situation had finally settled upon him. "In that case," he said at last, his tone heavy with reluctance, "I have no choice but to consent." Dr. Wilkins exhaled, relieved. "Very well. We propose that the post-mortem examination be conducted tonight." He cast a glance at the grey morning light, creeping through the drapes. "Or rather this evening," he hesitated, then added in a manner meant to be soothing, though it failed to be anything but hollow, "Of course, an inquest will be inevitable under such conditions, but please do not distress yourselves unnecessarily. These formalities are required." I saw Lawrence tense, his fingers twitching at his sides, though he said nothing. Dr. Everett reached into his pocket and produced 2 small keys, handing them to Jonathan. "These are the keys to Lady Blackwood's chambers. I have locked both rooms, and in my professional opinion, they should remain sealed until further notice." Jonathan accepted them wordlessly, his fingers curling around the cold metal. The doctors departed, their heavy footsteps echoing down the corridor. For a brief moment, none of us spoke. The house felt emptier in their absence, the air still thick with the scent of medicinal tinctures and the lingering metallic trace of something far more sinister. I had been turning something over in my mind for some time now, but I was uncertain whether to voice it. Jonathan, I knew, was averse to publicity. He despised scandal. He was an optimist by nature, one who preferred to dismiss problems until they became unavoidable. Convincing him of my plan might be difficult. Lawrence, on the other hand, was different. He was less bound by convention, more imaginative, more willing to consider possibilities others might dismiss outright. If I could win him over, I might stand a chance. I took a breath. Now was the moment. "Jonathan," I said, stepping forward, "I need to ask something of you." He looked at me, weary. "Go on. You remember my friend Inspector Alden?" I continued carefully. "The man I mentioned before, the investigator." Jonathan nodded slowly. "He's one of the best," I pressed on. "A brilliant mind, meticulous, methodical, and thorough. I want to bring him in." Lawrence's expression darkened instantly. "You want to call in an investigator?" His voice was sharp, almost angry, "before the post-mortem has even been conducted?" "Yes," I said, meeting his gaze, "because if there has been foul play, time is of the essence." Lawrence let out a sharp, disbelieving laugh. "This is absurd. You're getting carried away with Everett's theories. Wilkins would never have considered such nonsense if Everett hadn't put the idea into his head. That man has an unhealthy fascination with toxins. He sees poisons everywhere." I was taken aback by the vehemence in Lawrence's tone. It was unlike him. He was usually reserved, indifferent even. Why was he so quick to dismiss the idea? Jonathan hesitated. I could see the conflict in his face. I can't dismiss it as easily as you do, Lawrence, he admitted finally. I wish I could. He exhaled. But I have to admit, there are too many strange details. I don't like it. He turned to me. I'm not keen on drawing unnecessary attention to the family, but I suppose there's no harm in allowing you to bring in your friend, as long as he exercises discretion. I nodded eagerly. You have my word. Alden is discretion itself. Jonathan's lips pressed into a thin line. Fine then, do what you must. He hesitated, then added, almost to himself, though if our suspicions are correct, the truth seems clear enough already. There was a strange note in his voice, one of doubt, or perhaps something heavier. God help me, he murmured, if I am wronging him. A shiver passed through me. I glanced at the clock. 6 o'clock. There was no time to waste. I allowed myself 5 minutes, no more. 5 minutes to steady my thoughts, to gather my wits before I plunged headfirst into the depths of a mystery that had already begun to tighten its grip on Blackwood Manor. The library was dim, the heavy velvet curtains still drawn against the morning light. Dust swirled in the air as I ran my fingers along the spines of the books. Searching, I knew what I needed, and then there it was, a thick, leather-bound medical volume, its pages yellowed with age, but its knowledge as sharp as ever. I pulled it down, flipped through frantically until I found it. Strychnine poisoning. The symptoms were unmistakable. Agonizing convulsions, the rigid arching of the body, the sudden violent struggle against an unseen force. It fit. God help me, it fit. A chill ran down my spine as I reread the lines, the clinical description eerily mirroring what I had witnessed just hours before. But how? And why? The click of the grandfather clock in the hallway reminded me there was no time to waste. I shut the book with a snap and left it on the desk, its unsettling revelations pressing heavily on my mind. I had a name in my head, a man who could help, someone meticulous, methodical, unyielding in his pursuit of the truth. I stepped out into the corridor, my pulse quickening. It was time to call Inspector Alden. The hunt for the truth had begun. The Belgian investigators had taken up residence in a modest house near the entrance of the estate, nestled just beyond the wrought iron park gates. The grand winding driveway leading to the house was an unnecessary delay, and I knew of a narrow, overgrown path that cut through the tall grass, slicing the distance in half. Without hesitation, I took this shortcut, my mind racing with the weight of the morning's grim events. The air was thick with moisture, the remnants of dawn's mist, clinging stubbornly to the earth. Each step I took felt heavier than the last, as if the very ground beneath me shared in the burden of the terrible night. I had almost reached the lodge when movement in the distance caught my eye, a shadowed figure sprinting toward me. My breath hitched. It was Mr. Inglethorpe, his disheveled appearance, his hurried gait, the wild look in his eyes. It was as though he had emerged from some unseen abyss. His presence sent a ripple of unease through me. Where had he been all night? And more importantly, how did he intend to explain his absence? As he reached me, he clutched at my sleeve, his face a mask of feigned devastation. Too practiced, I thought. His voice, when he finally spoke, was thick with emotion, yet something about it rang hollow. My God, this is terrible. My poor wife. I have only just heard. I studied him, searching for the truth behind his theatrics. Where have you been? My voice was measured, betraying none of my suspicions. He hesitated, only for a second, before launching into his tale. Denby kept me late last night. It was nearly 1 by the time we were through. When I finally returned, I realized I had forgotten my latchkey. Not wanting to wake the household at such an ungodly hour, Denby insisted I stay the night. The words flowed smoothly, too smoothly, a convenient alibi, neatly presented, yet something about it felt off. The way he spoke, the rehearsed sorrow, the precision of his explanation, it was too perfect, too calculated. And how did you hear the news? I pressed, unwilling to let the moment slip. His expression twisted into something resembling grief. Wilkins knocked up Denby to tell him. My poor Emily, She was always so self-sacrificing, always giving too much of herself. A noble character truly. She overtaxed her strength. Revulsion churned in my gut. His words, laced with false sorrow, were spoken with the ease of a man who had no part in true mourning. My hands curled into fists at my sides, but I kept my face impassive. He was playing a role, and a poorly executed one at that. The evidence was mounting: his absence, his well-crafted lies, the almost forced display of grief. I fought the impulse to confront him then and there. Instead, I stepped back, forcing my features into neutrality. "I must hurry on," I said briskly, hoping he would not ask where I was headed. I turned on my heel, my mind set. There was no more doubt. Alfred Inglethorpe was hiding something. Within minutes, I found myself at the doorstep of Ravenwood Cottage, my knuckles rapping impatiently against the aged wooden door. The silence that greeted me was unsettling. The cottage stood in eerie stillness, shrouded in the damp hush of dawn, as though the very walls held their breath in anticipation. I knocked again, louder this time, urgency creeping into my actions. Still no answer. A gust of wind swept through the trees, rustling the branches like whispered secrets. Then, finally, a faint creak from above. A window was cautiously unlatched, and a familiar face emerged from the dimly lit interior. It was Detective Henri Leclerc. His sharp eyes widened in surprise upon seeing me below. "Mon Dieu, you are out early, my friend." I wasted no time. In hurried, breathless words, I relayed the tragic news, the sudden death, the cryptic final moments, the inexplicable absence of her husband. Leclerc's expression darkened as I spoke, his sharp mind already piecing together threads of the mystery. "Wait, I will let you in," he said, disappearing from the window. Moments later, the door creaked open, and I stepped inside. The air carried the scent of old books and faint traces of pipe smoke. The detective's meticulous nature was evident in the room's arrangement. Everything in its place, not a speck of dust out of order. Even as I sat, the gravity of the situation weighed heavy on my shoulders. Leclerc, ever composed, moved about the room with unhurried precision. "Now tell me everything. From the beginning. No detail is too small," and so I did. I spoke of my sudden awakening, in the dead of night, of Lady Harrington's cryptic, gasping words, of Mr. Harrington's suspicious absence. I described the argument from the day before, the simmering tension beneath the estate's polished surface. I recalled the whispered conversation I had overheard between Miss Evelyn Blackwood and the late lady, fragments of a deeper hidden resentment. The accusations, the veiled threats, the lingering animosity that now seemed all too important. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, my retelling frantic, disjointed. More than once I found myself doubling back, repeating a detail I had nearly forgotten. Leclerc, however, remained patient, listening intently as he methodically fastened his cufflinks, as though each piece of clothing he adjusted was another puzzle piece slipping into place. At last I finished. The silence stretched between us, thick with unspoken implications. Leclerc smiled, not a smile of amusement, but one of quiet understanding. "Your mind is in turmoil, yes," he said gently. "You are rattled. This is natural. But the mind, Monin, is like a room full of clutter. We must arrange it, tidy it. We will sort the important from the trivial. The facts will reveal themselves, if only we listen." He made a small dismissive gesture, as though sweeping away invisible dust. The useless details, poof, gone. What remains? "Ah, that is where the truth lies." I frowned. "That's all well and good, but how do you know what is important and what isn't? That's the part I never understand." Leclerc chuckled softly, turning to the mirror to adjust his tie with careful precision. His reflection met my eyes, his voice calm yet firm. "Ah, my dear friend, that is where the true mystery begins. No, Moninis, it is never so simple." Leclerc's voice carried a quiet authority as he leaned forward, his sharp eyes glinting with intensity. "One fact leads to another. Each must fit like the pieces of a puzzle. If a piece does not fit, that is where the truth hides." He gestured dramatically with his hands, his fingers tracing invisible connections in the air. "Now tell me, What is the fact that does not align? What small, seemingly insignificant detail refuses to settle into place? I hesitated. A missing link. I had recounted everything, the final moments, the strange quarrels, the suspicious absence of her husband. What had I overlooked? Leclerc's gaze sharpened. Careful, my friend. The worst mistake a detective can make is to dismiss something as unimportant. Every detail matters. The tiny, trivial thing that does not fit, that is where the solution lies. I frowned. You always say that. That's why I made sure to tell you everything, whether it seemed relevant or not. Leclerc gave a small approving nod. Bien, you have done well. Your memory is strong, and you have recounted the events faithfully. But he added, tilting his head, your method of telling them. Mon Dieu, a disaster, chaotic, but I forgive you. You are agitated. I let out a frustrated sigh. Then what have I missed? Leclerc picked up his coat, dusting it off with exaggerated care. Something simple, something that no one thinks about. He paused, then looked at me with a knowing smile. Did Lady Harrington eat well last night? I blinked. What? Surely he was joking. But no, Leclerc was buttoning his coat with the utmost seriousness. I shook my head. I don't know. I didn't notice. And frankly, I don't see why it matters. Leclerc cupped, adjusting his cuffs. Ah, but it does. It is of the first importance. I was growing exasperated. She wasn't in the mood for dinner, if that's what you mean. She barely touched her plate. She was agitated, understandably so. It wasn't surprising. Leclerc murmured under his breath. Yes, it was natural. Or was it? Before I could question him further, he snapped his small leather case shut, and turned to me with brisk efficiency. Now I am ready. We will go to the Harrington estate, and examine matters on the scene. As we stepped outside, he gave me a once-over, then suddenly reached out, straightening my tie with practiced ease. You dressed in a hurry, mon ami. There, now you are presentable. I shook my head, still baffled. You're worrying about my tie at a time like this. Leclerc merely chuckled. Details, my friend. Everything is in the details. We set off toward the estate. The air was crisp, the vast parkland glistening under the soft morning light. As we approached the grand entrance, Leclerc slowed, his expression unreadable, as he surveyed the stately mansion. So beautiful, he murmured, his voice tinged with something almost sorrowful, and yet behind those elegant walls, grief, secrets, and perhaps something far worse. Leclerc studied me intently, his sharp gaze unwavering. I felt a flush creep up my neck. His silence was weighty, deliberate. The grief in the house, was it genuine? Was the family truly shattered by Lady Harrington's death? I had assumed so, yet now, standing before the grand estate, I was struck by a peculiar absence of sorrow. Of course there was distress, shock, the disquiet that follows an unexpected tragedy, but there was no raw, searing grief, no weeping by the windows, no hushed sobs behind closed doors. The air lacked the weight of true loss. Lady Harrington had been respected, perhaps even admired, but loved, that was another matter. Leclerc nodded, as if reading my mind. You see it now, don't you, mon ami? There is a void here, not of loss, but of sentiment. She was generous, yes. She was kind, perhaps, but she was not theirs. Blood tells. His voice was measured yet firm. I exhaled, still processing his words. Leclerc, I said at last, I keep thinking about it. Why did you ask if Lady Harrington ate well last night? I can't make the connection. We walked in silence for a moment. Leclerc's face was unreadable, his thoughts tucked away behind that ever-calculating mind of his. Finally, he spoke. I do not mind telling you, though you know, mon ami, I prefer to keep my conclusions to myself, until I am ready to prove them. He paused, before continuing. The theory as it stands, is that Lady Harrington was poisoned, a slow, deliberate act, but there is something odd, something unnatural about the timing. I frowned. How so? Let us break it down, he said, as if we were in a classroom. The poison, strychnine, they claim, was supposedly administered in her evening tea. Yes. What time was it served? Around 8 o'clock, I answered. Leclerc nodded. Precisely, meaning she would have consumed it shortly thereafter. Now, mon ami, strychnine is not a patient poison. It acts swiftly. Within an hour, the body should have begun to seize, the muscles to convulse. Yet what do we see? Nothing. No symptoms. No signs. Not until nearly 5 in the morning, 9 hours later. Does that not strike you as odd? I hesitated. Perhaps the dose was slow-acting. Leclerc shook his head. Non, strychnine does not wait. His expression darkened, his mind spinning at a speed I struggled to match. Unless something delayed it, and what can delay the effects of poison? I thought for a moment before it clicked. Food. Leclerc smiled. Exactement. A heavy meal could slow absorption, force the poison to linger in the stomach before wreaking havoc. But according to you, Lady Harrington ate very little last night. She was agitated, without appetite. So tell me, what delayed the poison? Because, my friend, something did, and that is very curious indeed. Before I could respond, we neared the estate. The towering house loomed before us, its elegant facade untouched by the tragedy within. John Harrington emerged from the grand doors, his face lined with exhaustion. This is a dreadful situation, Monsieur Leclerc, he said gravely. Hastings has told you. We wish for as little publicity as possible. Leclerc gave a small understanding nod. I comprehend, monsieur. You wish only to be cautious. Nothing more. John exhaled, running a hand through his hair. We have only suspicion so far, no real proof. Ah, Leclerc murmured, his gaze steady. But suspicion, monsieur, is the first whisper of truth. John turned to me, pulling out his cigarette case. He lit one, inhaling deeply before exhaling into the cool morning air. You know Ingleby has returned? He asked. I stiffened. Yes. I ran into him. John exhaled again, flicking the match casually into the flower bed beside him. Leclerc stopped mid-step. His eyes followed the match as it nestled among the damp soil. Without hesitation, he bent down, plucked it delicately between 2 fingers, and walked to the nearest stone planter. He buried it neatly, dusting off his hands as he straightened. I stared. John stared. Leclerc simply smiled. Details, gentlemen. It is always the details. Leclerc's voice was calm, but his words carried an unmistakable weight. That difficulty will not exist long. John frowned, clearly unsettled by the cryptic remark, but Leclerc said nothing more, merely extending a hand as John placed 2 keys into his palm. Doctor, Falston thought it necessary to lock the room. Leclerc nodded, the barest flicker of amusement passing over his face. Then he is very sure. That makes things simpler for us. We ascended the grand staircase, its polished steps gleaming under the dim morning light. At the top, the heavy oak door loomed before us, the entrance to the room where Lady Harrington had drawn her last breath. Leclerc turned the key and stepped inside, immediately securing the door behind us. He moved with swift efficiency, scanning the space with sharp, analytical eyes. I lingered near the threshold, hesitant to disrupt any potential clues. Leclerc, however, did not approve of my caution. Mon ami, he said, with exaggerated exasperation, why do you stand there like an immovable statue? Are you afraid of disturbing footprints? Bah, an entire parade of people has trampled this carpet already. No footprints remain to be discovered. Come, aid me in my search. He set down his leather case upon a round side table, but the moment he removed his hand, the table wobbled precariously, the loose top tilted, sending the case tumbling to the floor. Leclerc caught it just in time, shaking his head. Ah, what a house! One may be surrounded by wealth, yet comfort remains elusive. With that observation, he resumed his search, his fingers gliding over every surface, his eyes missing nothing. He stopped abruptly at the writing desk, where a small purple dispatch case sat, its lock secured by a simple Yale key. Leclerc removed the key and handed it to me. Look closely. I examined it, but saw nothing remarkable, just an ordinary key, its handle adorned with a twisted wire loop. Leclerc gave a faint nod, as if filing the detail away for later. He moved next to the adjoining door that led to Miss Cynthia's room. You said this door was bolted, he asked. I nodded. He unbolted it, and swung it open, then shut it again, repeating the action with meticulous care. He tested the mechanism, tilting his head slightly as if listening to something unseen. Then, with a sudden flick of his wrist, he produced a pair of delicate forceps from his case. Reaching into the bolt's mechanism, he extracted a minute speck of something so small I could barely see.
Okay.
With great care, he sealed it inside an envelope, his expression unreadable. I watched him, my curiosity mounting. He gave no explanation. Then his gaze fell upon a silver tray on the dresser. Upon it rested a spirit lamp, a small saucepan, and an empty cup and saucer. A dark liquid clung to the bottom of the saucepan. I swallowed. How had I failed to notice this before? Leclerc dipped a fingertip into the liquid and tasted it cautiously. He grimaced. Cocoa, with a trace of rum. His inspection led him to the debris strewn across the floor, the overturned bedside table, the shattered reading lamp, a scattering of books and matches, and a crushed coffee cup. Leclerc's sharp intake of breath made me step forward. This is interesting. I followed his gaze. What is? He gestured toward the broken lamp. Observe the chimney. It has snapped in two, but the pieces remain where they fell. And yet, the coffee cup. I looked down at it. The porcelain was crushed to powder, as if stamped beneath a heavy boot. I frowned. Someone must have stepped on it. Leclerc's voice dropped to a murmur. Precisely, someone stepped on it, and the reason they did so was either because it contained poison, or mon ami, because it did not. A chill ran through me. Leclerc straightened and crossed to the mantelpiece, where he absently adjusted the arrangement of porcelain figurines. It was a habit of his, a telltale sign that his mind was racing. Then, as if making up his mind about something, he stooped down and retrieved a set of keys from the floor. He twirled them in his fingers before selecting a single one, its surface smooth and bright. With a quiet click, he tested it in the lock of the purple dispatch case. It fit. He lifted the lid, hesitated, then closed it again, without examining the contents. Instead, he placed both the bunch of keys and the original Yale key into his pocket. "I have no right to search these papers," he murmured. "But someone must do so, immediately." Leclerc moved with the precision of a man accustomed to finding secrets in the unseen. He knelt beside the washstand, his fingers gliding over the edges of the drawers, pausing for a fraction of a second, when he encountered a faint indentation inside one of them. He did not comment, merely filed it away in his mind, his expression unreadable. Then, rising fluidly, he crossed the room to the left-hand window, where a barely perceptible stain on the dark brown carpet caught his attention. To the untrained eye, it was insignificant, a mere discoloration lost in the weave of the fabric. But Leclerc was no ordinary observer. He dropped to one knee, tilting his head slightly, eyes narrowing as he studied it. Then, in a move that made me suppress a shudder, he leaned in and inhaled deeply. "Curious," he murmured. He pulled a small glass dropper from his pocket and extracted a few drops of liquid from the stain, depositing them into a test tube before sealing it with careful deliberation. Then, reaching into his coat, he retrieved a worn leather notebook and, with quick, decisive strokes, began writing. "We have encountered 6 points of interest," he announced, his pen moving across the page. "Shall I list them, or would you prefer to?" "Go ahead," I said hastily. 1. The coffee cup, crushed into fine powder, not merely broken. That is intentional destruction. 2. The locked dispatch case, key in place, suggesting someone wanted access but then changed their mind. 3. The stain on the carpet. I frowned. That stain could have been there for weeks. Leclerc shook his head. "Non, mon ami, it is still damp, and it smells of coffee, but not only coffee." 4. A fragment of dark green fabric, very fine, barely a thread, but distinguishable. "Ah," I exclaimed, recalling the tiny envelope he had sealed earlier. "That was what you collected." "Yes, it could belong to Lady Harrington's own dress, perhaps meaningless, but perhaps not." He paused dramatically, then swept a hand toward the floor near the writing desk. 5. This. I followed his gaze, and saw a large waxy stain, unmistakably candle grease. "It must have happened last night," I said, frowning. "We were all distraught, or perhaps Lady Harrington dropped her candle herself." You brought only one candle into the room, correct? I nodded. Lawrence carried it, but he swore he saw something near the mantelpiece, something that left him paralyzed. Leclerc's eyes gleamed. Interesting. He moved to the dressing table and pointed. See here, Lawrence's candle, still present, still intact, but note its color, pink wax, and yet, the stain on the floor is white. Lady Harrington had no candle of her own, only her reading lamp. So tell me, mon ami, whose candle left this mark? I stared, my mind racing. Then, what do you deduce? Leclerc simply smiled. The kind of infuriating smile that told me he had already seen the truth, but would not yet share it. And the sixth point? I asked, eager to distract myself from the unsettling implications of the candle wax. Is it the cocoa sample? Leclerc shook his head. I could have counted that, but no. The sixth point, that I shall keep to myself for now. His gaze swept the room once more, landing at last on the fireplace. The grate held only cold, lifeless ash, the remains of a fire that had burned out long before dawn. But Leclerc's expression sharpened. Fire destroys, he murmured, and yet sometimes it leaves behind traces of what it sought to consume. Without another word, he dropped to his knees and began sifting through the ashes, his fingers working deftly, carefully lifting fragments and discarding them in silence. Then suddenly, he stopped. His entire body went rigid, his breath catching ever so slightly, and then in a voice barely above a whisper, he spoke. Ah, now this is most intriguing. The tongs, Harris. I thrust them into his waiting hand, watching intently as he carefully extracted a crumpled, half-burnt piece of thick parchment from the fireplace. His eyes gleamed as he smoothed it out, revealing a faint imprint of hurriedly scrawled words. There, my friend, he murmured. What do you make of this? I examined it closely. The paper was heavier than standard stationery, perhaps legal in nature. A sudden realization struck me. This is part of a will. Harris nodded, his face grave. Precisely what I anticipated. I stared at him, my mind racing. You expected this. He carefully folded the fragment, tucking it away in his case with that meticulous precision of his. My thoughts swirled. A will? Destroyed. Who would have done this? And how had they even entered? The room had been locked from the inside. Come, Harris said, rising briskly. We must have a word with the maid. Dolores, isn't it? I led him through the grand corridor, passing the late Mr. Everleigh's chamber. He paused only to make a swift, sweeping survey of the room before we continued. Upon reaching the drawing room, I left to summon Dolores, but when I returned, Harris was gone. Harris, I called, out here. His voice drifted from beyond the French windows. I found him outside, admiring the garden in the dimming evening light. Marvelous, he muttered. The symmetry, the precision, look at those hedges, trimmed with such intent, recently, too. Yes, I believe the gardener was tending them yesterday, but this patience, my friend, he cut in. One must appreciate the details. This case is more important than hedges, Harris. And how can you be certain that these hedges do not hold the key to our mystery? I sighed. There was no reasoning with him when he was like this. He turned to Dolores, who stood stiffly, hands clasped before her. You served your mistress for many years, did you not? 12, sir. Then you were quite fond of her. She was a good woman. Then you will not mind answering my questions. Yesterday afternoon, there was an argument, was there not? Dolores hesitated. Sir, I don't know if I ought to. Madame Everleigh is dead, Harris said gravely. If there was foul play, we must find the one responsible. You would want justice, would you not? Justice? Dolores's eyes darkened. There's one person in this house I never trusted. A terrible day it was when they stepped foot here. Harris let her temper subside before continuing. Tell me exactly what you heard. She inhaled sharply. It was around 4, perhaps later. I was passing by when I heard raised voices. I did not mean to eavesdrop, but I could not help but hear her say, "You have lied to me, deceived me, betrayed me." He spoke back, but too low for me to catch. Then she cried, "How dare you? I gave you everything, and this is how you repay me, with disgrace." More murmurs then. It is decided. You think I will hesitate because of scandal. I will not. Then the room fell silent. You were certain it was Mr. Everleigh's voice. Without a doubt. What happened next? She rang for tea at 5. When I brought it in she looked dreadful, white as a sheet. She was holding a letter, staring at it as if it were poison. These words, "And everything changes," she whispered. Then she told me, "Never trust a man, Dolores. They are never worth it." And the letter, where did she put it? In her purple case, I imagine. That is where she kept her most important papers. The key to that case. She lost it, didn't she? At lunch, yes. She was quite upset. Harris reached into his pocket and produced a small key. Was it this one? Dolores gasped. That's it. But where did you find it? Harris only smiled. Tell me, did your mistress own a dark green dress? No, sir. Anyone else in the house? She frowned. Miss Claudette has a green gown, but it's a light one, evening wear. Harris showed no reaction. I see. Moving on. Did Madame Everleigh take sleeping powders? Not last night. She ran out 2 days ago. Are you certain? Positive. And she never asked you to sign anything yesterday? No, sir. She was writing letters last night. Do you know to whom? 4, sir. 1 to Miss Alderidge, 1 to Mr. Beaumont, the lawyer. The 3rd was to St. Clair's fine dining. The 4th, I cannot recall. Try. Dolores squeezed her eyes shut in concentration. No, sir. It's gone. Harris was unfazed. Did she drink cocoa every night? Yes, sir, with milk, sugar and a bit of rum. Who brought it to her? I did, sir. At what time? I left it on the hall table around 7:15, then took it to her room at 8. So, between 7:15 and 8, it sat unattended. Yes, sir. Dolores turned red. And if there was salt in it, sir, it wasn't me. I never put salt in it. Harris's sharp eyes flickered. Interesting. A deep silence filled the room. He reached into his pocket once more, pulling out a small box. I found this in Madame Everleigh's washstand. I peered at it. Sleeping powders. Yes, but look at the label. I read it. 1 powder to be taken at bedtime if required. Do you see what is missing? I frowned. No chemist's name. Harris nodded. Curious, isn't it? A creak at the doorway announced the arrival of Annie, the second maid. She looked half frightened, half excited. Harris wasted no time. Annie, you cleared the study last night. What do you recall? 4 letters, sir. 1 to Miss Alderidge, 1 to Mr. Beaumont, 1 to St. Clair's, and oh, the 4th. Yes, it was to A sudden gust of wind slammed the French window open. Annie yelped. Harris barely blinked. His gaze remained locked on her. Yes, Annie. To whom? She swallowed hard. It was addressed to, but she never finished. A piercing scream rang through the house, and the mystery deepened. Poirot tapped his fingers lightly on the armrest of his chair, his expression unreadable. Annie, standing nervously before him, twisted the edge of her apron, waiting for him to speak. When he finally did, his voice was calm, measured, almost indifferent. You say you saw salt on the tray? Annie nodded quickly. Yes, sir. Coarse kitchen salt it looked like. I didn't notice it when I first took the tray up, but when I was about to take it into the mistress's room, I saw it. I suppose I should have taken it back and asked cook to make fresh cocoa, but I was in a hurry. Dorcas was out, and I thought the cocoa itself was fine. Perhaps the salt had just spilled onto the tray, so I dusted it off with my apron and took it in. Hastings could barely contain himself. His pulse quickened as he exchanged a glance with Poirot, but the detective's expression remained impassive, his sharp eyes giving nothing away. Hastings, however, was electrified by the realization. Annie, unknowingly, had just handed them a crucial piece of evidence. If only she had known that what she so carelessly brushed away was no ordinary kitchen salt, but a lethal dose of strychnine, one of the deadliest poisons known to man. Poirot, however, remained unshaken. He continued in the same quiet, deliberate tone. When you entered Mrs. Inglethorpe's room, was the door leading to Miss Cynthia's room bolted? Oh yes, sir. Always was. Never opened. And the door to Mr. Inglethorpe's room, was that bolted as well? Annie hesitated. I couldn't say for sure, sir. It was closed, but whether it was bolted, I don't know." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "And when you left, did Mrs. Inglethorpe bolt the door after you?" "No, sir, not then, but she usually locked it at night. The door to the passage, that is." Poirot's eyes gleamed for a moment. Then he asked suddenly, "Did you notice any candle grease on the floor when you cleaned the room yesterday?" Annie frowned. "Candle grease? No, sir. Mrs. Inglethorpe only used a reading lamp." "Then if there had been a large patch of candle grease on the floor, you would have seen it?" "Yes, sir, and I'd have removed it with blotting paper and a hot iron." Poirot gave a small nod before switching to an entirely different question. "Did your mistress ever own a green dress?" Annie blinked in surprise. "No, sir." "Or a green mantle? A cape? Perhaps a sports coat?" "No, sir, not green." "What about anyone else in the house?" Annie thought for a moment, then shook her head firmly. "No, sir." "You are certain?" "Quite sure." "Bien." Poirot gave a satisfied nod. "That is all. Thank you." Annie let out a nervous giggle, and exited the room with an awkward curtsy, her footsteps creaking as she left. As soon as the door shut behind her, Hastings exploded with excitement. "Poirot, this is a huge discovery." Poirot merely raised an eyebrow. "What is a huge discovery, mon ami?" "Why, that it was the cocoa that was poisoned, not the coffee. That explains everything. Of course, the poison took effect in the early morning, because the cocoa was only drunk in the middle of the night." Poirot gazed at him with an amused expression. "So you believe the cocoa contained strychnine?" "Of course. That's salt on the tray. What else could it have been?" Poirot shrugged. "It might have been salt." Hastings exhaled sharply, frustrated. Poirot was being infuriatingly calm. It occurred to him, perhaps for the first time, that his old friend was growing slower with age. Perhaps it was fortunate that Poirot had someone like him, someone with a sharper, more open mind. Poirot, however, was watching him with a twinkle in his eye. "You are not pleased with me, mon ami." "My dear Poirot," Hastings said stiffly, "you have every right to your own opinion, just as I have to mine." Poirot smiled, a most admirable sentiment. Then, as if the conversation had never happened, he turned abruptly toward a small desk in the corner. "Whose desk is that?" "Mr. Inglethorpe's." Poirot approached it, testing the roll top. "Locked, but perhaps one of Mrs. Inglethorpe's keys will fit." He tried several, his fingers quick and practiced, until he gave a small triumphant exclamation. "Voila, not the key, but good enough." Sliding back the roll top, he scanned the neatly arranged files but did not examine them closely. Instead he merely remarked, "Decidedly he is a man of method, this Mr. Inglethorpe." To Poirot this was the highest compliment. Hastings, however, found it baffling. What did it matter if the man was methodical? Poirot was rambling, unfocused. There were no stamps in his desk. Poirot mused. But there might have been, mon ami. There might have been. His gaze drifted around the room before he pulled a crumpled envelope from his pocket and tossed it onto the table. Hastings picked it up, frowning. It was a dirty, old-looking envelope, the kind that could easily be overlooked, but scrawled across it, in uneven, almost frantic handwriting, were a few seemingly random words. Something cold crept down Hastings' spine. The answer was here, hidden in plain sight. And yet, Poirot was already moving toward the door, his expression unreadable. "The room has told us what it can," he murmured. "Now we listen elsewhere." Hastings clutched the envelope, heart pounding. Somewhere within these scattered clues lay the truth, and perhaps, just perhaps, it was even more terrible than they had imagined.